The firm that patented the genetic mutation suffered by Angelina Jolie sees its shares rise significantly following her announcement of her double mastectomy. Should our genetic material be patented? And might the actress's revelation lead to public health risks if it's not carefully discussed? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. The actress Angelina Jolie shocked many this week when she announced that she'd undergone a double mastectomy. In an editorial in the New York Times, she explained that the operation had drastically reduced her chance of breast cancer. Her bold decision to go public with the news has received wide praise. Such discussion of women's health will have a beneficial impact on all of our awareness of issues often left unspoken. But there has also been concern from some women's healthcare specialists who fear that the revelation could inspire a wave of similar requests for what's an incredibly painful, drastic, and in the majority of cases, unnecessary operation. Jolie's announcement has also brought attention to the increasing corporatization of breast cancer treatment in the US. Of particular concern is that the genes that mutated in Jolie have been patented by the company Myriad Genetics, something that critics say keeps the costs of treatment prohibitively high for millions of women. The patent is being challenged in the US Supreme Court. Joining us from New York, we have Sandra Park, an attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union's Women's Rights Project and one of the lead attorneys challenging gene patents in the Supreme Court. In Los Angeles, Karuna Jagger, the executive director of Breast Cancer Action, an advocacy group working to end breast cancer. And in Baltimore, Kathy Helzelzauer. She's a medical oncologist and director of the Prevention and Research Center at Mercy Medical Center. Myriad Genetics, the company who has patented the BRCA gene, declined to appear on the program. And let's begin with that gene and specifically that genetic mutation that Angelina Jolie announced that she has. It is very rare. In fact, fewer than 1% of women in the US are thought to have BRCA gene mutations. BRCA gene mutations are thought to cause only about 5 to 10% of breast cancers and about 15% of ovarian cancers. But women with the genes have up to an 87% lifetime risk of developing breast cancer and an up to 54% chance of developing ovarian cancer. Because the company Myriad Genetics has a monopoly on BRCA testing, it determines the cost, which is about $3,000. Insurance companies will only cover testing if patients are at a high enough risk for breast cancer. Right now, about 2% of women meet that criteria. And Myriad sets its own threshold for assistance. Single patients must earn less than $23,000 a year to qualify for such assistance. Lots to digest there. But let's begin, first of all, Professor Helzelzauer, with the specific condition, the specific mutation, the BRCA genes then. These are genes that help the body suppress tumors, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We all have these genes, and there are two that we talk about, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And if there's a change in the spelling of those DNA building blocks that we look for called mutations, people will be at increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer, and for BRCA2, some other cancers too, and including men who are at risk for male breast cancer.
So in Jolie's case then, Professor, her family history perhaps strongly suggested that she might be at risk of this mutation, so that's why she went for testing.
Well, presumably I don't have her whole family history, but
Right.
what I know from what I read is her mother had ovarian cancer at an early age too. So we look at red flags in the family history, early age of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, the two occurring together in a family make you very concerned there might be a mutation in these genes, and I'm sure that's why she went to have genetic counseling and testing.
So should all women now go out and take a blood test to determine whether they are at genetic risk of breast or ovarian cancer?
Well, as you pointed out, it is a rare condition. So among women who have breast cancer, only about 10% are due to inherited risk. And then part of that inherited risk is BRCA1 and 2 mutations. So it's not for everybody, and we do screen the family history as an indication for testing.
And Jolie opted for a double mastectomy, but are there alternatives if you do find a genetic mutation in these particular genes?
If you have a mutation, there are many options for women to consider, and double mastectomy surgical approaches are one option. Depending on the gene, there's chemo prevention, hormonal prevention. We have increased screening that we offer to women if they are at high risk, so to offer them the best chance of early detection. And then there's the ovarian cancer risk. There's more agreement that surgical options are really the option because we don't have good screening options there.
All right, so then as Professor Helzelzau suggests, then we're not privy to the factors that went into Angelina Jolie's decisions here. So let's widen this discussion out now. Karuna Jagger, then, as we welcome then the increased discussion once again then of women's health issues, perhaps the starting point is what conclusions should we not draw from this particular case?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question and an important one to raise. The Angelina Jolie story is not an every woman's story. Of course, many people have pointed out that she has access to the best health care in the world, presumably, and she was able to afford the genetic test, which too many women cannot afford. At the same time, because she has this mutation, which so dramatically increases her risk of cancers, she is, when we talk about high risk, we're talking about two different categories. For a woman without this mutation, if we think that high risk is roughly double the risk of an average woman, that still only accounts to perhaps a 25% lifetime risk of breast cancer. As the doctor pointed out, in Jolie's case, we're talking about up to an 85 or greater lifetime risk of breast cancer. So it's very important that we really don't group together all high risk. To kind of further take this point, to drive this point home, women are diagnosed with what's called ductal carcinoma in situ. It's considered a pre-cancer. So women with this pre-cancerous, non-invasive tumors, they have a 20 to 30% risk of developing an invasive cancer. Again, 20 to 30% risk compared to upwards of 80–85% lifetime risk of breast cancer. So very, very important to distinguish that the BRCA mutations are really a different category. And for these women, this information absolutely has the potential to be life-saving. It is so important that women are able, with this increased family risk, with a BRCA mutation, are able to access that information so that they can make the choices that are right for them.
Right. So I suppose if you're looking for some universal moral from all this, then, Karuna, it's simply the notion of the need for healthcare access so women can make informed decisions for themselves, then, not based on some general sense of cancer being out there and bad.
Absolutely. We're in this very odd situation where 30 years after these campaigns for breast cancer awareness, the average woman vastly overestimates her individual risk of breast cancer. There was a study that someone cited recently that said girls age 8 to 18, about 30% of those girls think they might have breast cancer. It's basically a statistical impossibility. So what we see is that awareness campaigns are pushing younger and younger. We see average women without an increased risk of breast cancer vastly overestimating their personal risk, and consequently, even with medical counseling, choosing very aggressive therapies. Those discussions need to be distinguished from the discussions around women with a hereditary risk and right. Really a very high risk of cancer.
And that's why perhaps, although as welcome as more discussion is about breast cancer, Professor Helzelzau, the issue of double mastectomies is quite interesting here. There is perhaps a fear that there has been a trend recently for people to have a double mastectomy, even though they don't need it. Even though, actually, in some ways, in the history of the women's health movement, one of the great achievements was making sure that doctors don't resort to double mastectomies automatically, basically. I mean, what's going on?
Yeah.
Professor.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
There's been a pendulum swing in here in treatment where the push before was to look for conservative treatment, with lumpectomy and radiation. And I do see this switch to, and I think there's awareness, but there's created a lot of fear. And as I like to point out, that getting breast cancer is not dying from breast cancer. that most women survive and live their normal life out having dealt with breast cancer and moving on from that. And that's in the absence of having bilateral mastectomies. So I do think it is a balance. This is where counseling, risk assessment, keeping perspective is so important to have that access along with this testing and for those very high risk families, but to have a better perspective on this whole issue.
All medical interventions involve risks and benefits, and women need unbiased information free of corporate influence in order to make those decisions for themselves. And so you see in Angelina Jolie's op-ed, she kind of goes out of her way to reassure women who might be considering this kind of surgery, talking about the beautiful results and the small scars, and saying that she was back at work within a few days of this surgery. And so you can see she's really painting a reassuring picture. I want to be very clear that all surgery involves risks, and we know that when it comes to implants after a mastectomy, there's very high rates of complications. About 40% of women who have breast implants after a mastectomy will require a second surgery within 3 years. Now, none of this is to pass judgment on Angelina Jolie's personal choice. Rather, it's to point out we should never take these interventions lightly, and we must really evaluate the risks and benefits in an unbiased way.
Is there a sense then, Professor, that it's that our better understanding of cancer perhaps isn't being communicated in some of these campaigns? Karina Jagger mentioned these ductal carcinoma in situ cancers, the DCIS, which don't necessarily lead to fatal cancer. However, because of some of the awareness campaigns and the screening campaigns and so forth, they are being detected perhaps where once they might not have been, and they're thus somehow leading to treatment despite counseling and advice. What's going on, do you think?
Well, there's over-treatment. As part of the problem is we can't decide who would go on to progress to invasive cancer with great certainty and not. So we all have to live with uncertainty, and that's really comes down to the big issue. There is a problem with this fear that's been created too, and is also desire not to want to deal with it ever again. So women who've had breast cancer choosing perhaps bilateral mastectomy because they don't want to go through everything they went through with the first one. So there does need to be counseling, and what I always tell women too is time away from that event is important too. Even for women too that are found to have a mutation, it takes time to think about what's the best option for them and when. So that's where it is so important to have counseling and to reassure women that they do have time for decisions, whether they've had breast cancer and making that decision, or that they're at very high risk.
But Karina Jagger, this does link into the discussion that we hear from time to time on screening and on the emphasis on screening, and whether indeed any reduction in mortality that we've seen over the last few years is because of increased screening or simply because of increased treatment, whether screening in fact can lead to unnecessary treatment and doesn't necessarily make any difference as to whether the cancer will eventually be successfully dealt with once it is discovered.
Right. I mean, there's a whole show there. So basically, if you look hard enough, we will find tumors, we will find lesions, and we see that the introduction of widespread population screening through mammography has increased the detection of DCIS, these pre-cancers, these non-invasive cancers, and we have to keep in mind that the breast is a non-vital organ, and a cancer that stays in the breast will never become life-threatening. And what we see is that women in the country are doing mastectomies. They're choosing mastectomies for a condition that is not itself life-threatening. There's others who might argue that there's an opportunity to watch and wait here, and that going to such an aggressive treatment protocol, it's too extreme. And I think this does really, again, touch on what are we doing with these awareness campaigns? Are we fueling fear, or are we actually providing people with tools and steps so that we can appropriately address and end the epidemic? And
just briefly, Professor Helzelzauer, before I bring in Sandra into some of the other aspects of this Angelina Jolie story there, I mean, what then would you suggest as a medical professional is an informed position on this debate about mammograms and screening and how often you should get them and their use?
Well, that's another whole story
know, exactly.
to get into that. But I mean, there is evidence that there's benefit, and there has been a reduction, and some of that reduction in mortality is due to screening, and a portion of that, and probably the majority, is due to some advances in treatment over time. So there has been some benefit. It's not as much as we would like, and of course we would love to have prevention that's better, and we do have some means to prevention, which is another option, short of surgery.
All right, well,
so I think that there's a role for screening right now, but it's all this downside of that, and overdiagnosis, overtreatment, all these issues that we have to cope with.
Right. Okay, so there is one thing we know, though, as far as these breast cancer awareness campaigns are concerned, and this entire breast cancer culture that seems to have emerged from once being something that was barely discussed. There's a lot of money being made, actually, from this as well, both by pharmaceutical companies and sponsorships and all sorts of things. So, Sandra, this is where perhaps I can bring you in. The specific genes that mutated in Angelina Jolie, these BRCA genes, one company has patented these genes, and we should be clear, it's the genes that have been patented, not any sort of testing off the genes, but the genes themselves that we all carry. How do they manage that?
That's a great question. They obtained their patents over a decade ago, and under a patent office policy that actually has granted thousands of patents on human genes. And the argument they use is that they can obtain patents once they've isolated the genes. But all that isolation means is that they've removed the genes from the cell in your body. And to us, that's just a ridiculous argument. It's analogous to saying, once a doctor removes a kidney from your body for transplant, that somehow the doctor has invented that kidney and can now obtain a patent on it. The gene removed from your body is still a gene, it's still a product of nature, and the Supreme Court has said for many, many years that products of nature cannot be patented.
Was it possible to test for mutations of BRCA before Myriad isolated this particular gene?
Myriad did contribute to scientific knowledge because they identified that these genes are connected to breast and ovarian cancer risk. So that was the scientific contribution they made. But the problem is they obtained patents on the genes. And I think most people agree they did not invent these genes. The genes are elements of human biology that you inherited from your parents. That risk is something you inherited from one of your parents. So certainly they did contribute to scientific knowledge. They enabled us to know that these genes should be tested. But the problem is, once they got the patents on the genes, they could stop all other laboratories from performing testing on the genes, even if those laboratories were using different or better or cheaper testing methods.
All right, well, we do have the statement that Myriad Genetics issued following, or rather defending its patent. So here's their statement, quote, "The diagnostic tools based on the company's patents have been used by more than 1 million women in its brief with the Supreme Court. Myriad said that without adequate intellectual property protection, companies would face significant obstacles conducting pioneering research and bringing new products to market that save lives. Myriad also defended the cost of testing, saying more than 95% of patients in the US have access to BRCA analysis through private insurance or other coverage. The average out-of-pocket expense for patients is $100. The company also offers a financial assistance program that provides reduced charge or free testing to low-income uninsured women. More than 5,000 women have received free testing from Myriad during the past 3 years. Karina Jagger, I think you already wanted to come in there while I was still reading that, but first of all.
Excuse me.
That's all right.
Well, 95% is good, but it's not enough. Every woman who needs this information should have access to the information. And as far as Sandra's point that Myriad contributed to science through the identification of the BRCA genes, while that is true, we know that scientific contributions do not necessitate and warrant patents. And what we see is that since being granted the patent, Myriad has actually been an obstacle to progress. And so Myriad is using an outdated test which provides incomplete information. It's too expensive. Women can't access this information. It's particularly problematic for women of color who are likely to get a result of ambiguous. In essence, Myriad tells them, you have a mutation, but we don't know whether it does or doesn't cause cancer. We don't know if it's a benign mutation or is linked to an increased risk of cancer, and that puts women in an impossible situation. And so I think to acknowledge Myriad's role as part of what began as an international collaborative team is not to justify a patent that allows them to control the development of any new device or technology, any targeted therapy, and to really limit and inhibit progress in this area.
Sandra Park, then very quickly, would the research on isolating this gene have been conducted without Myriad's money?
Oh, certainly. And we know that there were teams around the world that were looking for these genes, that were very close to finding them. And in fact, for BRCA2, there was a UK team that was set to publish the BRCA2 sequence in a major scientific journal. But the day before that publication, Myriad applied for its patents, and so they beat them literally by 1 day and were able to get those exclusive rights to the genes.
Is there some distinct factor about isolating DNA that makes it patentable as opposed to kidneys and other organs, Sandra, as far as you can tell? I mean, is that the legal argument? I mean, how does this work?
That is Myriad's legal argument, but we don't think that isolation has any particular significance. It's simply removing something from its natural environment. So if you're removing iron from the rock, would that make iron patentable? It's still an element of the periodic table.
But if I was to somehow isolate my own BRCA1 gene from a cell and I poked around with it and put it under a microscope and had a look, could I be prosecuted?
Technically, you would be in violation of their patent. I'd hope they wouldn't come after you, but you would be in violation.
I mean, the mind boggles even further. Does Myriad have the right to harvest my BRCA then?
Well, one of the things I came across when doing this work is meeting many geneticists who, of course, have the full capacity to isolate their own BRCA1 and 2 genes. But as soon as they do that, they would be in violation of the patents.
And of course, this has wider implications for the entire human genome, I suppose. I mean, so your case is going to be pretty crucial to all this, I would expect.
Yes, it's been estimated that 20% of human genes have been patented in the United States. Those genes relate to a lot of different diseases, including colon cancer and Alzheimer's disease. So our hope is that if the Supreme Court rules that Myriad's patents are invalid, that ruling will really get at the heart of the Patent Office's policy of granting these patents and affect other gene patents as well.
All right, we only have about 3 minutes left. I wanted, Professor, to bring you back into this discussion then about breast cancer and how it's dealt with. There is a criticism, though, that amidst the pink ribbons and the fun runs and so forth, which have a valuable impact in keeping morale up and so forth, there's been less, and indeed the emphasis on screening, there's been less focus perhaps on what's causing cancer. And again, with Angelina Jolie's case, again, the focus is once again on genetic dispositions towards cancer. But it's probably worthwhile just to talk about the percentage of cancer that is genetic and where we are in figuring out where the rest of the cancer is coming from.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. When we're talking about these strong inherited risks, it is a small proportion of all breast cancer cases, and it's true for any cancer site. And there is a big factor for the environment and other factors, and we do need to have a lot more information on that to explain the majority of cancer that occurs, especially breast cancer and other cancer sites. We didn't talk about ovarian cancer, but there's been a lot less work done in that cancer, and it's much more fatal. So I think we really do need to expand beyond genetics, but there's an interaction with genetics. On one level, we have other minor susceptibility factors that make us more susceptible to radiation, for example, if we have that exposure. So we do need to look at the bigger picture, too.
Karina Jag, I mean, there's always that suspicion that some of those who are actually sponsoring the charities whose emphasis is on screening and fun runs and who wrap up their products in pink and so forth, and this is what your campaign has often been talking about, are precisely the sort of companies who we should be examining a little closer as to whether they are producing or using the chemicals that might be causing environmental factors in cancer.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. You know, we've been challenging pinkwashing for nearly a dozen years. Those are the companies that claim to care about breast cancer. Meanwhile, they're using chemicals in their products which are linked to an increased risk of the disease. So that is true corporate hypocrisy. They're, you know, making a lot of money, billions of dollars through pink ribbon campaigns without taking the steps to really decrease the incidence of breast cancer. Just going back to your original point, we must keep in mind that when you say 1 in 8 women will develop breast cancer, that means 7 in 8 women will never develop breast cancer over the course of their lives. That's the general population. And it's very interesting to think about women with the BRCA mutations, because while their risk is extremely high, it does not guarantee that a woman will get cancer. And I think there's really an opportunity here to look at those women with the BRCA mutations who never develop cancer and do a better job of really understanding the mechanisms of breast cancer and true prevention.
Karina Jager, thank you very much. Sandra Park, thank you. Professor Kathy Helzow, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.